two items of business here tonight. First, we will run the annual Dirksen clip. And I always try to make it somewhat pertinent to the times. And so in this clip, President Truman has issued an executive order to seize the steel industry. Republicans, including Everett Dirksen, cry foul, and that it is unconstitutional to issue this executive order. Does this sound familiar? So, while it is in the courts, and before it gets to the Supreme Court, Dirksen is suspicious of what the courts have done.
Do you think that anything has happened to the judiciary that the American people should be concerned about? Is the judiciary still an adequate check and balance on executive power in this country?
Well, I don't like particularly to pass on that question except to say that I can find you a lot of people in the country who have their fingers crossed on that one and are beginning to wonder whether a political note has intruded itself into the judicial findings in the country.
So, there you have it. So, the Dirksen Award tonight goes to J. Newton Small, and the piece that she did was really amazing. If there are any members of Congress here tonight, heads up, because she writes about how Congress gets along, how people in Congress get along, and in her specific article, it is about women senators who could get things done, and the reason they got things done is because they were friends. They went out to dinner together. They went to each other's homes together. They went to each other's states and visited their homes there. They knew their kids. So when I was growing up as the senator's daughter, we did the same thing. I played tennis with Jacob Javits, and Chuck Percy and Mark Hatfield and John Tower and their kids would all come over and we'd have a barbecue and everyone knew each other. So in that light, Jay has written about how the women senators got things done. And in 2014, which I did not know, the women senators produced 75% of the legislation that passed in that year. And it was all because they were friends. They got together. So if you're here tonight, members, get together. Have a barbecue, go out to dinner, meet their kids, have fun, and get to know each other. So, this is a tremendous article. I recommend it to everyone. And Jay, after that, wrote a book called Broad Influence. So, the Dirksen Award goes to J. Newton Small.
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you so much to the National Press Foundation for this incredible honor. I have to admit that after covering Congress on and off for the past 15 years, it's been my lifelong dream to win this award, and so I'm really incredibly honored. I want to thank ELLE Magazine for running the story about the women in the Senate. So they could have picked any chapter, and Lori Abramson is here tonight, over here, and she was the one who picked the story about the women in the Senate to run. And she could have picked any chapter out of my book to run, and she actually picked the women in the Senate, which I was really surprised about. She could have done the Hillary chapter, she could have done the Pelosi chapter, she could have done another number of ones, and she picked this one because she loved just the story. I want to thank also my mom, who the book is dedicated to, who passed 6 years ago, and who was a woman who worked her entire life, and I used to watch cry sometimes at the dinner table after I'd gone to bed, and I'd sneak out and I'd hear her sobbing about how hard it was being a manager, particularly in the United Nations as a diplomat, and men would not shake her hand, not look her in the eye, and she really had a tough time, and I think things have changed, hopefully, for the better. I also want to thank the women of the Senate, who all pretty much I got interviews with almost all of them for this story and for my book and for the original story in Time Magazine that ran about the women of the Senate ending the government shutdown when the men would not speak to each other in 2013. They were just amazing to talk to. And when I was first assigned the story as one of the only women on staff at the time I kind of rolled my eyes and thought, really, the women writing about the women? But I was so inspired in interviewing these women about the differences they made that session, the 114th session. As Sissy said, they produced 75% of the legislation that passed the session. If you think about the bills that passed, it was really striking, right? So it was Debbie Stabenow and the Ag Bill, Barbara Boxer and the Transportation Bill and the Water Resources Bill. All of the women got together and passed the Violence Against Women's Act. You had Barbara Mikulski and all of the appropriations bills and the CRs, and most importantly, in my book, Patty Murray and the budget deal. So Patty Murray told me a story early on about when she was in the first year in office after being elected in 1992 about giving a speech on the Senate floor. And she talked, it was during the debate over the Family Medical Leave Act. There's no such thing as paid leave right now. The Family Medical Leave Act in 1993. And she talked about how she went to the Senate floor and gave a speech about a man that she knew from Washington State who had taken time off from work to be with his dying son, who was terminally ill. And he nearly lost his job and nearly bankrupted his family, and how important it was to pass this bill because of people like her friend. And when she was leaving the Senate floor, a senator, a senior senator, a Democrat, stopped her and said, "We don't tell personal stories here. That's not what we do. We tell facts and figures. That is what the Senate is about. You don't tell personal stories here." And she looked at him and said, "I tell personal stories here because that's what I do. And I think it's really important to tell the stories of how what we do affect people in America." And she told me that years later, that same senator came back to her and said, "You're so right. It's absolutely important to tell people's stories here because that's the difference that we make here in the Senate." And in writing the book and in writing the article about the women of the Senate, I was struck about how women in the Senate really embody empathy. And I thought a lot about the word empathy in this time particularly. And how they, as Sissy said, would have regular dinners. And they would, every month, get together and get to know each other. And they were friends, and they trusted each other. And not only that, but they reached across the aisle. And so in the 114th session, women sat atop 11 of the 20 committees, both ranking members and chairs. And they not only had dinners with each other as women, but they insisted on having dinners with their male counterparts as their chairs and ranking members. And they would go home and visit them in their home states, and they would insist on those members visiting them in their home states. And these are relationships that have really eroded in Washington. Members don't have dinner with each other anymore. Members don't visit each other anymore. It's considered almost a betrayal. And women in this time, and I have to say women are not a sort of unilateral people. Women are not all the same. There are definitely women who are very different. Some women are much more competitive. Some women are much less into, are much less into win-win scenarios. But studies show, generally speaking, and this has been studied a lot, that women are much more collaborative than men, and they are much stronger at empathy than men. And so in this case, the women of the Senate actually ended up producing 75% of the legislation because they reached out across the board and really tried to understand how their male counterparts worked. And so I'm going to give another example of this with Patty Murray. One of the first meals that she had with Paul Ryan, who was her counterpart she was the chair of the Budget Committee in the Senate, and he was the chair of the Budget Committee in the House, was in the Senate dining room, and they both talked about their lives. They talked about how their fathers died young, and that affected their lives, and Patty Murray her family briefly went on food stamps. Paul Ryan had discovered his father's body when he was 16 years old, and he died of a heart attack. And they talked about paying their way through college together. They talked about fishing, and they talked about football, which became the entire language of their negotiations. Never once was the word budget mentioned in any of those talks. And I thought it was really interesting because Patty's whole point was you have to get to know each other. You have to empathize with each other. You have to find what's a win for them and what's a win for you, and what's a loss for them and what's a loss for you. And that is, I think, somewhat the dying art of legislating in Washington. We now look at zero-sum games. We look to kill each other. We look at trying to find ways that we can win absolutely and destroy the other party. And it's, as Teddy Kennedy once would have said, we have made the perfect the enemy of the good. So Patty in that one breakfast with Paul Ryan talked about all these things except for the budget, and figured out that football was the language in which they discussed things, and they ended up coming together and forming this budget deal, which in the nuclear winter of 2013, remember the nuclear option that was enacted, potentially a harbinger for another nuclear option down the road. But that nuclear winter, the only thing that got through was the budget deal between Patty Murray and Paul Ryan, which ended the fiscal cliffs, a deal in which the president and the speaker, the vice president, and Mitch McConnell, then the minority leader of the House, and all the senators and everyone else could not come to. They had tried to stop these halting fiscal cliffs, and they never could. And it was really Patty Murray and Paul Ryan that did it. And when I interviewed them both, and they talked about what brought them to it, they talked about commonalities, and they talked about friendships, and they talked about what brought them together rather than set them apart. And in a time of Washington where I just want to remind people about empathy, the opposite of empathy is not the absence of emotion. The opposite of empathy is actually shame. And I think there's too much shame sometimes in Washington these days. I take heart in the idea that there's a lot of women running for office these days. I've read an article recently that there are actually 13,000 women running for office right now, which are thinking about running for office, which could really be a game changer if they actually all do run. There's a certain irony in winning the Dirksen Award 6 weeks after you leave political journalism. I actually left time in October and before the election to start a company called Memory Well. My father passed of Alzheimer's last year, and a few years ago when I put him into a home, they asked me to fill out a questionnaire about his life. And instead of writing down 20 pages of questions about what my father was like, I said, look, let me write his story. I'm a journalist. And they were like, you're weird, but sure. And so I wrote it down, and it really changed his care. His caregivers knew him for the first time. And he had spent 20 years working in development in Africa, and 2 of his caregivers were actually Ethiopian. And they were like, oh my God, you lived in Ethiopia. And they ended up reading to him about Haile Selassie and Addis Ababa every day for hours and hours. And they formed bonds and empathy, and it was really amazing. So journalism, to me, can be used for so many other things, to form empathy on a really everyday level, not just for the famous and the infamous and the rich of people that we've written about, at least that I've written about for my entire career. And that's where I'm going right now, back to Memory Well and back to writing about people who living with Alzheimer's and dementia. But you are forging forward and writing about people in Washington and the famous and the infamous and the interesting and the sometimes crazy. And so I just want to leave you with this thought that it's so important to have empathy for those and to try to understand those that you are covering and those that you are across the aisle from and those that you think of as enemies or think of as opponents, because they are people too. And without understanding them, you may never really understand the whole point of this. And the whole point of this isn't to win or to lose, but to help people. So thank you for this amazing award, and I really am so deeply honored, and thank you so much for your attention tonight.